The night it all started, I was in the garage, elbow deep in oil, trying to figure out why my damn car was making that weird knocking sound every time I hit 40. It wasn't urgent, but it was one of those things that gnawed at me. I had the radio on low, some old rock playing in the background, and the faint hum of crickets outside. It was peaceful in that way a man appreciates when the world outside is too loud. I didn't hear her come home at first, which was odd because the garage door was open, and usually, I'd hear her car pull into the driveway. But when I stepped out for a breath of fresh air, wiping my hands on an old rag, I saw her car parked down the street instead of in front of the house. That was the first thing that made my brain itch in the wrong way. Lauren never parked anywhere but the driveway, not unless there was a damn good reason. I leaned against the garage door, watching from the shadows, my heartbeat suddenly syncing up with the distant, steady thrum of bass from a car further down. A few minutes later, I saw her. She wasn't walking like someone who had just come home from a long day of work. She was moving slow, hesitant, like she was checking to see if anyone was watching. I almost called out to her, but something in the way she paused at the curb, looking over her shoulder, made me stop myself. My stomach turned cold. Instead of coming straight to the house, she pulled out her phone, tapped something, then looked back again before finally making her way up the walkway. I ducked back inside the garage, pretending to still be busy under the hood. I didn't want to spook her. I wanted to see what she'd do. The door to the house creaked open, and I heard her slip inside. I waited a few seconds, wiped my hands again, then followed, making sure to walk loud enough so she'd know I was coming. I found her in the kitchen, standing by the sink, glass of water in her hand, but she wasn't drinking it. Just standing there, looking out the window above the sink. She jumped when she saw me. Jesus, Steve. You scared me. I raised an eyebrow, leaning against the doorframe. Didn't hear you pull in? You parked down the street for a reason. She blinked, just for a second too long, before forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Oh, yeah. The neighbors had a bunch of cars out front, and I didn't want to squeeze in. A blatant lie. The neighbor's driveway had been empty when I walked out. I let it hang in the air between us for a moment, studying her. Her hair was a little messy, not in the windblown, just got out of the carway, but like someone had run their fingers through it too many times. Her shirt was slightly wrinkled, like she had been laying down. And then there was the smell. Not perfume, not sweat, but something in between, something unfamiliar. I walked over to the fridge, pretending to grab a beer, my mind already racing in 10 different directions. Late night? She took a sip of water, swallowed hard, and nodded. Yeah, got caught up talking with Karen after work. You know how she is. Once she starts venting, it's impossible to get away. Another lie. I had seen Karen's car leave the office parking lot 2 hours before Lauren should have even been off. I popped the cap off my beer and took a long sip, watching her over the rim of the bottle. She wasn't looking at me anymore, just staring into the water like it held some kind of answer. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew claws, digging into the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. I didn't sleep that night. I laid in bed with my back to her, my eyes fixed on the dark outline of the dresser, listening to her breathing, slow and steady, like nothing had changed. But something had. It sat in my chest like a weight, pressing down harder every time I replayed the scene in the kitchen. The parked car down the street, the hesitation before she walked in, the way she had jumped like she wasn't expecting me to be home. None of it sat right. I wanted to believe there was some logical explanation, something that would make sense if I just asked the right question, but I didn't. I let the silence stretch until morning, until she got up and started moving around, acting like everything was normal, but I wasn't ready to let it go. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already dressed for work, her hair neatly tied back, makeup carefully applied, everything perfectly in place like the night before had never happened. She glanced up, gave me a small smile, then went back to pouring her coffee. You're up early. I leaned against the counter, watching her, searching for something in her face that would give her away. Didn't sleep much. She nodded, stirring sugar into her cup, not asking why, not looking at me for more than a second. Everything okay? I let the question hang for a moment, waiting to see if she'd fidget, if she'd avoid my eyes again. Yeah, just been thinking. She finally looked up, and for a second, I thought I saw something shift in her expression, something guarded, but it disappeared just as fast. About what? I exhaled slowly, pushing off the counter and walking toward the table, pretending to be casual. About last night. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup, the only sign that she had heard me, but her voice was steady when she spoke. What about it? You coming home late? parking down the street, looking nervous when you walked in. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice calm, giving her a chance to explain. Didn't seem like a normal night. She hesitated, then let out a small laugh, shaking her head like I was being ridiculous. Steve, you're reading too much into this. I already told you. I was talking to Karen. I didn't want to squeeze into the driveway. It's not a big deal. It was the way she said it that made my stomach tighten. Too smooth. Too rehearsed. Like she had been expecting the conversation and had already planned her response. I studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly, not letting on that I knew she was lying. All right. She relaxed slightly, sipping her coffee, acting like the conversation was over, but it wasn't. I waited until she left for work before I started digging. If she had nothing to hide, there wouldn't be anything to find. I started with the car. Walking down the driveway, I kept my eyes on the neighbor's house, making sure no one was outside, then pulled open her driver's side door and slid in. It smelled like her perfume, faint but fresh, as if she had sprayed it again that morning. The floor was clean, the seats perfectly in place, but the passenger seatbelt was twisted, like someone had grabbed it in a hurry. I reached down, feeling along the side of the seat, and my fingers brushed against something small and smooth. I pulled it out, my chest tightening when I realized what it was. A receipt. Not from dinner. Not from a bar. A gas station, timestamped just after midnight, in a part of town that was completely out of the way from her usual route home. My hands tightened around the slip of paper as I stared at the address. She hadn't been with Karen. She had been somewhere else, with someone else. I shoved the receipt into my pocket and stepped out of the car, my pulse hammering as I tried to push down the anger rising in my throat. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, didn't want to believe what my gut was telling me, but I had spent too many years with this woman not to recognize when she was hiding something. I went back inside and sat at the table, staring at my phone, debating my next move. I could call her, ask her directly, force her into another lie just to see how far she'd go with it. Or I could wait, gather more, find something she couldn't talk her way out of. I took a slow breath, forced myself to be patient. If she was lying about last night, she'd slip up again. And when she did, I'd be ready. I spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept circling back to the receipt. Every time I looked at it, I felt that same tightness in my chest, the kind that told me I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't ready to face. I wasn't stupid. A gas station in the middle of the night, completely out of the way, didn't point to anything innocent. I wanted to be wrong, wanted there to be some logical reason she'd gone there, but every possible excuse felt like a lie before it even formed in my head. I could have ignored it, could have thrown the receipt away and told myself not to be paranoid, but I had already crossed the line. Once you start looking, you don't stop until you find what you're looking for. I checked the time and saw that she would be at work for at least a few more hours. I needed more. A single receipt wasn't enough, not if I wanted the truth. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove. I told myself I was just going to check, that I wouldn't jump to conclusions until I had proof. The address on the receipt wasn't far, about 15 minutes from our house, but in the opposite direction of her job. As I pulled into the gas station parking lot, I scanned the area, looking for something, anything that would give me an answer. The place was small, just a couple of pumps and a convenience store. Nothing special, but I wasn't here for the gas station. I was here for what was around it. Across the street, there was a cheap motel. The kind that didn't ask questions. The kind where people went when they didn't want to be seen. My stomach twisted as I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, watching cars pull in and out. There was no way this was a coincidence. She hadn't stopped for gas. She hadn't stopped for a snack. She had been here for something else, something she didn't want me to know about. I forced myself to breathe, forced myself to think. Sitting in the parking lot wasn't going to get me answers. I needed more. I grabbed my phone, opened my banking app, and checked our joint account. She paid for everything with her card, never carried cash, and if she had been stupid enough to use it here, I'd know exactly what she was doing. I scrolled through the transactions, looking for anything from the past week. Gas station, grocery store, work lunches, the usual. And then I saw it. A charge from 2 nights ago. The name wasn't familiar, but a quick search told me everything I needed to know. It wasn't a restaurant, wasn't a store. It was the motel. My hands clenched around the phone, my body going completely still as I stared at the screen. It was real. There was no more guessing, no more doubts. I had the proof right in front of me. She had been here. She had spent money here. And there was only one reason a married woman checks into a motel in the middle of the night without telling her husband. I exhaled sharply and leaned back against the seat, my mind racing in a dozen different directions. I could go inside, ask for a name, see if she had been alone. But I already knew what they'd say. She wasn't here by herself. She had been with someone. The question was who. I needed more. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I wasn't going to let her talk her way out of this. Wasn't going to let her make me feel like I was the crazy one. I had already seen the way she lied without hesitation, the way she had stood in our kitchen and looked me in the eye like I was imagining things. Not this time. I turned the car around and drove home, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. When I walked inside, I went straight to our bedroom, straight to the nightstand where she kept her work bag. I never went through her things. I had never needed to. But that was before I found out my wife was checking into motels with someone else. I unzipped the bag and started going through it, careful not to mess anything up. Her wallet, makeup, a few receipts crumpled at the bottom. I pulled them out, unfolded them, scanned each one. A coffee shop near her work, a grocery store, another gas station. And then I saw it. Another receipt, same motel, different date. I let out a slow breath and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the proof in my hands. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This wasn't some misunderstanding. It had been going on for a while, and she had been careful. Careful enough that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't started looking. I heard the front door open, heard her keys hit the counter, her voice calling out, "Steve? You home?" I closed my eyes for a second, steadying myself, then stood up and walked out of the bedroom. She was in the kitchen, setting her bag down, completely unaware that everything had changed. "Yeah," I said, my voice calm, controlled. "I'm home." She smiled, but there was something forced about it, like she was trying too hard. "Everything okay?" I walked over to the counter, set the motel receipt down in front of her, and watched as the color drained from her face. "Why don't you tell me?" Lauren's hand froze midair as she reached for her coffee mug. Her eyes locked onto the small, crumpled receipt on the counter like it was a loaded gun. I watched her throat move as she swallowed. Saw the way her fingers twitched like she wanted to grab it, but wasn't sure if that would make things better or worse. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, didn't even breathe, just stood there staring at the proof of what she had done, of where she had been, of what she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. Finally, she exhaled, slow and careful, forcing a smile that didn't come close to reaching her eyes. "What's this?" I leaned against the counter, crossing my arms over my chest, keeping my voice steady even though I could feel the heat crawling up my neck. "You tell me. Looks like you've been spending money on something you didn't mention." Her fingers moved toward the receipt again, hesitating just before she picked it up. She looked down at it like she was hoping it would say something different, like maybe it would rewrite itself and let her off the hook, but the printed black letters weren't going anywhere. She turned it over in her hand, stalling for time, her lips pressing together like she was deciding how to play this. "Steve, it's not what you think." I let out a sharp breath through my nose, shaking my head as I pushed off the counter. "Don't do that. Don't insult me like that. I already checked, Lauren. I know exactly where this place is, and I know exactly what kind of motel it is. You want to tell me why my wife has been checking into a room in the middle of the night?" She flinched at my tone, but not enough. There was no guilt in her expression, just calculation, like she was figuring out which lie had the best chance of keeping this from blowing up in her face. She set the receipt down carefully, folding her arms and tilting her head, suddenly shifting from shock to defensive like she had just realized she didn't have to explain anything if she refused to acknowledge what was obvious. "You're overreacting." I felt something in my chest tighten, something that made it hard to keep my hands from curling into fists at my sides. "Overreacting?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Lauren, you snuck off to a motel while telling me you were with Karen. I know you weren't with her, so how about you tell me where you really were?" She shook her head quickly, too quickly, like she was still trying to regain control of the situation. "I wasn't sneaking off anywhere, Steve. I was just meeting someone to talk. That's all it was." I stared at her, waiting for her to crack, waiting for the truth to finally come out, but she just stood there, arms still crossed, chin lifted just enough to make it clear that she was digging her heels in. She wasn't going to confess. She was going to hold on to this lie with everything she had, even now, even with the proof in front of her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the second receipt, dropping it onto the counter next to the first one. Her eyes flicked down to it, then back up at me, but she didn't move, didn't touch it, didn't say a word. "This wasn't just one night," I said, keeping my voice level even though I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears. "So tell me, Lauren, how long have you been sneaking off to meet him?" She stiffened slightly, her lips parting like she was about to say something, but then she stopped, pressing them together into a thin line. For the first time since this conversation started, her face changed. She wasn't playing anymore. She knew she was caught. The mask she had been wearing cracked just enough for me to see what was underneath, something colder, something harder. She wasn't sorry. She was just pissed that she had been found out. "I don't have to explain anything to you," she finally said, her voice clipped, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "You don't own me, Steve." I let out a short, humorless laugh, rubbing a hand over my jaw as I turned away for a second, trying to stop the anger from boiling over. "No, I don't own you," I said, turning back to her. "But I sure as hell deserve the truth. Or is that too much to ask for after 12 years of marriage?" She exhaled sharply, shaking her head like I was being ridiculous, like I was the one ruining this instead of her. "I told you, it was just a conversation. That's all. I didn't want to meet at a bar where people could see us and start rumors, so I picked somewhere private." I stared at her, waiting for her to flinch, waiting for her to show even the slightest bit of shame, but she just held my gaze, steady and unblinking. She had already decided that this was going to be her story, and she was going to stick to it no matter what. "You must think I'm really stupid," I said finally, shaking my head. She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose like she was getting tired of this conversation. "Steve, I don't know what you want me to say. You already made up your mind, so what's the point?" I felt something cold settle in my stomach, something final. I had given her a chance, given her a way out, and she had thrown it in my face. She wasn't going to admit anything, wasn't going to apologize. She had already moved on in her head, already decided that whatever she had done didn't matter enough to fight for this marriage. I stepped back from the counter, my hands dropping to my sides, my pulse slowing even as my chest burned. "All right," I said, nodding slowly. "If that's how you want to play it, fine." She frowned slightly, something uncertain flashing across her face. "What does that mean?" I looked at her one last time, at the woman I had spent over a decade building a life with, at the woman who was now nothing more than a stranger. "It means you're going to find out real soon." Then I turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the kitchen with her carefully crafted lies, knowing that whatever happened next, I wasn't going to be the one left in the dark anymore. I didn't go back inside the house. I walked straight to my car, got in, and drove. I didn't have a plan, didn't know where I was going, but I knew if I stayed there any longer, I'd say something I couldn't take back. The rage sitting in my chest wasn't just anger anymore. It was something sharper, something that made it impossible to think straight. I had given her every opportunity to tell me the truth, to at least have the decency to admit what she had done, and instead, she had chosen to treat me like an idiot, like I was supposed to just accept her pathetic excuse and move on. The way she had looked at me, the way she had crossed her arms and stood there with that defiant expression, like I was the one being unreasonable, made my blood boil. I drove without thinking, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The motel was still in my mind. The name of the place burned into my memory from the receipt. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. I made a sharp turn, heading in the direction of that gas station, my mind already running through every possibility. If she had been meeting someone there more than once, that meant whoever it was might have done the same. It wasn't just her I needed to catch. If I was lucky, I'd find out exactly who she had been meeting. 15 minutes later, I pulled into the same parking lot where I had sat earlier that day, but this time, I wasn't just looking. I got out of the car, walked straight toward the motel's front office, and stepped inside. The place smelled like stale coffee and cheap cleaning supplies, and behind the counter sat an older man with glasses perched on the end of his nose, flipping through a magazine. He barely looked up when I walked in. "Need a room?" he asked, still turning the page. I placed the receipt on the counter in front of him and waited until he finally glanced at it. "I need to know who booked this room," I said, keeping my voice calm, controlled. "A woman checked in that night. Short, dark hair, mid-30s. I just need a name." The man sighed, pushing his glasses up and shaking his head. "Can't give out guest information, man. Privacy policy." I exhaled slowly, pressing my fingers into the counter. "Look, I'm not asking for credit card numbers. I'm not asking for an address. I just need to know if she was alone." He frowned, finally looking at me properly, taking in my posture, the tension in my face. "You her husband?" I nodded once. He stared at me for a long moment, then let out a tired breath. "Look, I'm not supposed to say anything, but you're not the first guy to come in here asking about his wife. This ain't exactly the Ritz, you know? People don't come here for business meetings." My stomach twisted, but I kept my face blank. So she wasn't alone. He shook his head, rubbing the back of his neck. I checked in with her both times. Different cars, but same guy. Mid-40s, light brown hair, kinda stocky. Looked like he worked with his hands. Something in my mind clicked into place, but I couldn't grab onto it fast enough. You remember what kind of car? First time was a white truck. Second time a black sedan. Not rentals, at least not the kind we usually see. I stared at the counter, the weight in my chest getting heavier. I didn't recognize the description, didn't know anyone that matched, but that didn't mean anything. Lauren had an entire world outside of our marriage. People from work, people she had met through friends. Whoever this was, he wasn't just some one-time mistake. She had been careful, switching cars, picking places out of the way. She had been doing this long enough to know how not to get caught. I took a step back, nodding once. Thanks. The man shrugged. Sorry, man. Wish I had better news. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out, my legs feeling heavier with every step. By the time I got to the car, my hands were shaking. Not from sadness, not from heartbreak. From pure, unfiltered rage. Lauren hadn't just lied. She had planned this. She had made sure I wouldn't find out. And now, after all of it, she was standing in our kitchen pretending like none of it mattered, acting like I was the one making a big deal out of nothing. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, my jaw clenched so tightly it ached. I could go back home. I could confront her again, but what would be the point? She'd just lie again. She'd pretend like she had nothing to confess, that I was imagining things, that I was twisting the situation into something worse than it was. No, I wasn't going to give her the chance. If she wanted to play this game, I'd make sure she lost. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and opened the call log, scrolling through the names until I found the one I needed. I hesitated for only a second before pressing the button. The phone rang twice before a voice picked up on the other end. Hey, Steve. Everything all right? I swallowed, keeping my voice steady. Hey, Mark. You still got that guy who does private work? A pause. Then, yeah, why? I glanced back toward the motel, the neon sign flickering against the dark sky. I need a favor. Mark didn't ask questions. He never did. That's why I called him. He gave me a name and a number, told me to text instead of call, and to keep things vague at first. The guy, Jason, responded within the hour. I told him what I needed: surveillance, photos, confirmation. He asked for a name and a time frame. I gave him Lauren's and told him to start immediately. The price wasn't cheap, but I didn't care. If she wanted to lie to my face, I wanted to make sure she had nowhere left to hide. The next few days were a waiting game. I acted normal, pretended like nothing had changed, just like she had. We ate dinner together, went through our usual routines, but I watched her more carefully now. I saw the way she kept her phone angled away from me, the way she stepped into another room whenever she took certain calls, the way she glanced at me when she thought I wasn't looking, checking to see if I had let it go. She didn't bring up the motel receipt again, didn't try to explain herself further. That told me everything I needed to know. If she had been innocent, she would have tried harder. On the third day, Jason sent me a message. She left work early. White truck. Same guy as before. Following. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the text. It was happening again, right in front of me, like she hadn't even considered the possibility that I'd be watching. I called in sick to work, got in my car, and waited for Jason to send me a location. 20 minutes later, he did. The motel. Again. I parked a block away, gripping the steering wheel, my mind racing with everything I wanted to do. I could storm in, catch them in the act, make sure she had no way of denying it ever again. I could wait until she got home and throw her lies back in her face, watch her scramble for another excuse, another pathetic attempt at gaslighting me. But neither of those options felt right. Confrontation wouldn't fix this. She had already made her choice. She had already decided that I wasn't worth honesty. Jason sent another text. Room 14. I got out of the car, my body tense but controlled, my footsteps steady as I walked toward the front office. The same man from before was behind the counter, and when he saw me, he sighed, shaking his head. Back again? I slid $100 bill across the counter. Room key. He looked at the money, then at me, then let out a long breath before grabbing a spare key from the wall. He didn't say anything as he handed it to me. He didn't have to. I walked down the narrow hall, stopping outside room 14. I didn't hesitate. I slid the key in, turned the handle, and pushed the door open. Lauren was sitting on the bed, half-dressed, her shirt unbuttoned, her hair a mess. The man next to her froze, his hands still on her waist, his expression shifting from confusion to panic as he realized who I was. Lauren turned her head, and when she saw me, her face went pale. "Steve." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't. Just don't." She opened her mouth again, but nothing came out. The man, him, whoever the hell he was, shifted like he was about to stand up, but I took a step forward, and he thought better of it. "How long?" I asked, keeping my voice even. Lauren swallowed, her hands gripping the sheets. "Steve, how long?" Her gaze dropped to the floor. "A few months." I exhaled slowly, nodding to myself. That's all I needed to hear. I turned to leave, but she jumped off the bed, grabbing my arm. "Steve, wait. Please. It's not." I pulled my arm away from her grasp. "Not what, Lauren? Not what it looks like? Not a betrayal? Not months of lying straight to my face?" I shook my head, stepping back. "You had your chance to be honest. You chose not to be. That's all I need to know." She stared at me, desperation flickering across her face. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I let out a humorless laugh. "You don't check into motels by accident, Lauren." The man shifted again, and I turned my attention to him. "You her boss? Coworker? Or just some guy she picked up because she was bored?" He hesitated, then muttered, "We work together." I nodded again, filing that information away. "Well, congratulations. You can have her." Lauren's face crumpled. "Steve, please, don't do this." I stared at her for a long moment, taking in the sight of the woman I had spent over a decade with, the woman who had stood in our kitchen just days ago, looking me in the eye and pretending like I was crazy for suspecting anything. And now here she was, caught exactly the way I knew she would be. "I didn't do this, Lauren," I said finally. "You did." Then I walked out, letting the door slam shut behind me. The divorce papers were filed the next morning. Lauren tried to call. She texted. She even showed up at the house once, but I didn't let her in. There was nothing left to say. When I finally told her that everything would be handled through lawyers, she stopped trying. A week later, Jason sent me one last message. She met with him again today. Different motel. That told me everything I needed to know. Some people don't change. They just get better at hiding who they really are. And I wasn't going to waste another second of my life on someone like that.